Well, hello class, and I wish you were here. I'm looking out at my classroom with empty seats in it, but I am excited to go over the next URP, undesirable repetitive pattern. We talked about the confrontation avoidance accommodation cycle. This one is the competitive conflict escalation cycle. If you've read chapter 2, you probably have some experience with this cycle. This one's all about looking at your conflict not from a problem-solving perspective, because some people will look at a conflict and say, how can we make this work for both of us? Nope. Conflict is a game to be won. It is an argument to be won. And this is obviously really common. I think all of us have dealt with this, where we're going to focus on case building. I'm going to build my case against you, okay? I'd rather diverge as opposed to integrate my ideas and how to have a win-win solution. This is going to be a win-lose kind of discussion. So I'm going to show you why I'm right and why I win. That's really the mentality here, okay? And what happens is it just can bog down in the differentiation stage. Remember, the differentiation stage is where the discussion happens, where the conflict the communication is being had, where you're making an argument and you're refuting it, and then you're making another argument that your other person is refuting it. And this is really common in this cycle, where you listen to refute, you listen for weaknesses as opposed to listen to understand and empathize with the other person, okay? So this last term I want to talk about is schismogenesis. And schismogenesis is in your textbook, but ultimately I think the easiest way to think about it is that it's where both parties are kind of triggering each other with hot button issues, and it just makes the issue spiral even that quicker. So I think I had a student describe it as it's like the lighter fluid you pour on the flames of an argument. It just makes it accelerate. So that's a brief description of competitive conflict escalation style. A little bit more about schismogenesis. There's a couple that's discussed in your textbook. There's complementary schismogenesis, where one person is more powerful and more dominant, the other is more submissive, and that dominant person reminds the more submissive person how much power they have over them with regard to, I could fire you if I'm your manager, or I could fail you if I'm your instructor, or I could kick you out of the house if I'm the parent who's letting you live there, right? And then what happens? It leads to this avoidance accommodation cycle, because the more submissive person isn't going to want to engage in a direct conflict anytime soon. So that's complementary schismogenesis, just that reminding of the power one has over the other, whereas symmetrical schismogenesis is really more common in this competitive kind of conflict, right? This competitive cycle, where each person is, there's not an obvious power disparity, and they're going to stand toe-to-toe and argue it out, okay? And it escalates, and there's retaliation after retaliation, and that's where symmetrical schismogenesis, the retaliation after retaliation will typically have hot button issues triggering the other person into a behavior that's more emotional, that is, much more extreme perhaps. So moving on, the steps in a competitive escalation cycle, okay? Well, first of all, with all these cycles, there's generally unresolved issues between the two, okay? They're pulling these unresolved issues up from the past. You ever had that happen to you where yeah, geez, that was 5 years ago. We're still dealing with that? It just hasn't been resolved, right? And so that's usually how these repetitive patterns occur, is that there's something unresolved and it just keeps getting talked about, right? Argued about. And then we've already talked about it's all about being right. Okay, I like the example. I had a student who was really trying to cooperate, to really come up with and meet his girlfriend, in middle ground, and compromise is really what he was trying to do. But he was so stuck in I'm right, you're wrong, that it didn't really come out right. He said, you know what, I think I'm 90%, and I'll give you 10%. I think you're 10% right. I'm 90% right, okay? And that, you could see the effort. At least he's giving her 10%, right? He's kind of given, it is a compromise a little bit, but it didn't really work, obviously, because he was so insistent on how right he was, okay? So, generally speaking, there's one person ends up winning, and sometimes it's not really winning because there's unresolved grievances. There's frustrations from the person who feels like their needs weren't met, their interests weren't listened to. Oftentimes we don't feel listened to in competitive conflict, right? And those grievances can be held and fester, and later on could lead to, a really dysfunctional relationship, or maybe the end of a relationship. So I don't know if anybody really wins in this situation, but at least temporarily there's somebody who feels some satisfaction. So moving on, your textbook talks about all these different behaviors. I think intuitively you understand that these behaviors could lead to the escalation of a conflict. Talking louder, shouting, is going to lead to escalation of a conflict. Standing up over somebody and invading their space and pointing the finger at them in their face. Obviously, swearing and threatening is going to lead to escalating a conflict. And, disconfirming the other and saying, you know what, I don't really think you're trying your best, and I don't really think that you're really telling the truth here, or that can obviously lead to an escalation. We've talked about pushing buttons and triggering each other, and this one being egged on by bystanders. When there are more people present in a conflict, if this happens in public, boy, that adds so many other dynamics where it makes it difficult to really deal with an issue effectively, because now you're looking at face saving and trying to make sure you're not seen as in a negative light by the public or by family members or whoever happens to be there. So, I always recommend doing conflict in a private place if you can. If you can. So, observations about of competitive conflict escalation. I think that really the main idea is that the competitive argument occurs when one person wants to win no matter the damage to the relationship, okay? That they're putting their need to win over the quality of the relationship. And they don't care if it's going to harm it, at least in that moment. There's usually regret after, we've gone through this cycle. And, the thing is that it just really creates this pattern of needing to outdo each other. Well, I'm going to shout louder than you. Well, then I'm going to throw this and, I'm going to throw this back. And then I'm going to, leave the house and give you the silent treatment. Well, then I'm going to give you the silent treatment. So again, you're trying to outdo each other. And I think this is important too. If you meet somebody who says, I never lose arguments, I just always win my arguments. I've actually met a few people, being a speech and debate coach, that's something I've heard people say, not only in competitive academic debates, but also in their interpersonal relationships. And as I always think to myself, wow, how does the other people in your life, how do the other people in your life feel when you are always winning arguments? Because I bet there are some frustrations that they're harboring, okay? Unresolved issues. And you might ask, well, how do we get out of that cycle, okay? Well, number one, you got to control your emotions. Easier said than done. I think that there's a lot of processes in our textbook that can help you control anger, can give you techniques to, stop and think, right? The STLC model, the 6-step method, these various methods that can help you gather yourself and try to look at this conflict from a problem perspective, a problem that needs to be solved, right? As opposed to a game that needs to be won. I can't emphasize that enough, that the instant you start thinking about, oh, I'm going to win this, okay? I'm going to be the person who's the smartest in the room, and there's ego investment, and you get stuck in your positions. That's a really tough place to recover from, especially if you're wanting to look at, improving your relationship and, seeing conflict as a problem to be solved, okay? And you can step back and look at it more analytically. Now, of course, emotion is there, but can you control it? And that's really the key. Looking at it from a collaborative perspective, a collaborative style of conflict, as opposed to the competitive style of conflict. It's really difficult in a culture where competition, the value of competition, is ingrained probably since you were 4 or 5 years old on the soccer field trying to, score your first goal. So anyway, if there's another question or any other questions about this particular URP, I'm really happy to answer it. Please zoom in, please email, and I'll definitely get back to you as soon as I can. I hope you understood this, and thank you very much for listening.